What is it that makes St. Lucia special? What is its competitive advantage as compared to other Caribbean nations?
You know, we had to really think very hard about that question a couple of years ago. So when we had the financial recession, I was the Minister of Tourism at the time, and I remember assembling a meeting and asking that question: who are we? What is it that makes us the special place? And in the case of Saint Lucia, from a tourism perspective, it was romance. Saint Lucia is absolutely the most romantic island in the Caribbean. A lot of people liken it to Hawaii, but in the Caribbean. Very mountainous. The two famous things are the pitons that we have. But everywhere you go in Saint Lucia is romantic. So we have some of the most unique hotel products. Jade Mountain, Ladera, Hotel Chocolat, the list goes on. And we have 3 Sandals properties in Saint Lucia. Every restaurant you go to just screams romance. And every tour that you go on is the most romantic time. I mean, everybody is just falling in love over and over again in Saint Lucia. You're, one airport away from connecting anywhere in the world. So whether it be Miami, Atlanta, New York, Toronto, or London, between those 4 airports, you can connect to anywhere in the world.
People I trust tell me that you are the best Caribbean Prime Minister in a generation. You are more a businessman than a politician. You have a head for economics. What, in your estimation, would you say makes you the right person to lay the foundations for further growth in the St. Lucian economy?
The advantage I've had, yes, I'm a business person, but I have worked in government. I started off, my first job was as an economist in the government. I was also a director of tourism. I was the senior vice president of marketing and sales for Air Jamaica, which was a quasi-government and private sector. So what I bring is a clear understanding of how government operates, because I've worked within the framework of government, but with an understanding of what makes business work. Mm-hmm. And it's the combination of those two things. And a lot of people talk about business and politics, or business and government are 2 very different things. I don't see it that way. I think that business teaches you a discipline and a methodology for managing resources. And governments don't tend to be very good at that, because there is no such thing as accountability. Right. Civil servants are accustomed that every 5 years there's a possible change. There's certainly going to be a change of a minister. Very difficult to be able to hold people accountable when they know that you are only temporarily in that position. So I bring that component to it. So it's about processes. I'm a huge believer in processes. I think that more often than not, if what you're trying to achieve is not being achieved, it generally is a process. So it's bringing those practices. A vision, mission, and values must be able to measure what we're trying to do to be able to be successful. So I think that the combination of understanding the reality of being in government and how it works, along with best business practices, the combination of those 2 things, I think are going to generate tremendous results. The good thing for me is I've done it in government, I've done it in the private sector. Mm-hmm. And so really being Prime Minister is really just taking it on a larger scale. And so from the time that we were elected, we've already been implementing a plan. So even in opposition, I'm very proud of the fact that our manifesto wasn't one that was driven by polls. It wasn't about what we thought people wanted to do. We developed a plan first in terms of how we wanted to transform St. Lucia, which was that we want to double the GDP in less than 10 years.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that, because in order to double your GDP in a decade, you'd need 7% GDP growth a year. What, in the greater mosaic of the St. Lucian economy, how important a component is CIP?
So you have to go back in time. After 9/11, there was a huge migration of money into the Caribbean, because the Caribbean was perceived as being a safe haven. So location, 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 under the belly of America, access to America, to Canada, to Europe and Latin America. And by 9/11, Mexico and Colombia and Brazil were starting to boom as economies. So whereas Latin America was never perceived as a wealth place, all of a sudden that potential was arising. And here you have these chain of islands of which nobody's building any more islands in the Caribbean, so ideally located, independent countries, economically very stable, politically very stable, and perceived very safe havens. You also had the tsunami. And so all of a sudden these companies that were growing in Asia recognized they needed to diversify. They couldn't depend on one region of the world for their revenue source. So there was this huge increase in investment in the Caribbean. That investment was being fueled primarily through institutional financing. So banks, Icelandic banks in particular, Wall Street, Bear Stearns was a big player, and then your Canadian banks. What happened then was we had the recession. So the recession came, we went from the G7 to the G20. The focus became on saving themselves first. Then you had the financial crisis in Europe. So the Europeans now started focusing on Greece, on Spain, on Ireland, on Portugal, right? So when that financial crisis came, so the Icelandic banks went out of business, there was nobody to step in to replace that money. So projects did not get off the ground. St. Kitts had a CIP program to start off with, which came out of the necessity from the collapse of their sugar industry. And they use it as a diversification fund. And in addition to helping them diversify their economy, it also helped them pay off debt. And the IMF became a big believer in the CIP programs. So Antigua and Dominica and eventually Grenada followed suit. So the CIP basically created a new source of capital, to fuel now that economic development. And what's great about the CIP program, once it comes into the coffers of government, it's what we call free capital. It's unencumbered. And it's about now taking those monies to drive investment or pay off debt to be able to stabilize your overall economies. And we're seeing that market segment is growing because the world, unfortunately, is becoming even more unstable. So the desire of people, even Americans, to have secondary passports is growing. And some of the leading countries in the world have reached the pinnacle of their development on the backs of CIP. Canada and United States of America, and even England. So it's very difficult for them to now criticize us coming in. So it really comes back down to, in terms of the due diligence, that really separates one country from another in terms of the success of your programs. But CIP, absolutely critical component. And then in my mind, they are then new components to that. So residency is another component that you can add to the CIP program. And we're also extending it now to corporations. So we've created a Headquarters Act in Saint Lucia that allows businesses to move their headquarters to Saint Lucia. There is zero income tax. There is no duties on any of the equipment that they're bringing in, business equipment they're bringing in. There's no work permits, and the workers pay no personal income tax. So very similar to what's going on in Geneva. So if you think of the UN really as being major headquarters, the levels of incentives that the Swiss government give all of these diplomats who are here, which is no taxation, but what the country benefits from is the consumption. So because they have these entities here, they're continuously taking place conferences, they're continuously traveling, and they pay VAT on their day-to-day consumption. So that is the benefit to the state.
So do you hope to see one day Castries becoming the Geneva of the Caribbean?
In many ways, yes. We're actually making it more similar to Monaco in that regard, and that we're trying to create the legislative framework to make Castries a municipality and allow it to actually have its own credit rating.
But I want to return a little bit to the question I asked earlier and specific figures, if I may, on the CIP as a component of not just GDP, but also of government revenue. What are we talking today, roughly, ballpark figures, and do you anticipate that will increase or decrease over time?
First of all, there's different ways in which the money is earned. Even within CIP, there's different ways. So there is a donation. So the donation is monies that go into the state that generally go into some kind of account, okay? And those monies then are, the government is free to use those monies in a multitude of specific areas.
Yeah.
Then there are what we call the real estate investments. So where the country acknowledges a development as being a CIP project, people are allowed to make an investment in that project, expecting a return, and then they also happen to get a citizenship as well. I'm not as much of a fan of that component as I am as the funds going into the government directly. And the reason for this is that at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're leveraging our sovereignty.
Yeah.
So it's the people's money. So for me, I think it's much better if the money comes into that fund. So what we're doing in Saint Lucia is we're going to create a sovereign fund. Now that fund will be managed by a third party. So it acts as a blind trust to the government. The government has no day-to-day involvement in terms of where the money is going. They can either buy bonds from the government or they can make investments on an international basis, because the protocol is there that a sovereign fund from Saint Lucia investing money in the United States of America, as an example, there's no withholding taxes, we don't pay any taxes on it. So there's a huge benefit from that, and it's being, as I said, managed by professionals.
Right. Well, then let's segue from that and into the question of due diligence and how it relates to the correspondent banking system. Because Caribbean banks recently have been experiencing some challenges receiving funds from the countries from which these new citizens are departing. So Asian countries, Russia, Middle East, they send their money to either do the cash contribution or to get the property. But due to the correspondent banking system and the nature of what we commonly know as the SWIFT system, it's all going via the United States. And sometimes they'll halt or even reverse those payments on the basis that they do not feel they have sufficient documentation to let that payment pass through their doors. What I'd like to ask you is, what are Caribbean authorities in general and St. Lucian authorities in particular doing to mitigate this issue?
So first of all, the corresponding bank issue and CIP, two separate issues. So CIP is not what caused or is causing the problem with corresponding banking. Correspondent banking problem came an issue with Frank-Dodd legislation in the States, which was then followed up by another piece of legislation that basically said the US government was going to fine financial institutions that committed any infraction, not on the basis of the infraction, but on the size of the bank. Okay? So you could have the Bank of America where there was a small infraction that maybe been for $1,000. They're going to look at the size of Bank of America and they're going to fine them correspondingly. So what